Sarah Martinez had always been invisible at the military base. At 24, she worked as a communications technician, fixing radios and maintaining the complex systems that kept the base connected to the outside world. Her small frame and quiet demeanor made her easy to overlook, which had become both her protection and her curse. The abuse started 3 months after she arrived at Camp Pendleton. Sergeant Derek Morrison was her direct supervisor, a man twice her age with dead eyes and a smile that never reached them. It began with inappropriate comments about her appearance, whispered when no one else could hear. Sarah tried to brush it off as crude military humor, something she would have to get used to in this male-dominated environment. But Morrison's behavior escalated quickly. He started finding reasons to keep her working late, alone in the communications building. His comments became more graphic, more personal. He would stand too close when reviewing her work, his breath hot against her neck as he leaned over her shoulder. Sarah's hands would shake as she tried to focus on the circuit boards in front of her, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. The first time Morrison touched her inappropriately, Sarah froze completely. She had been reaching into a supply cabinet for replacement parts when she felt his hand on her back, sliding down toward her waist. She spun around quickly, stammering something about needing to get back to work. Morrison just smiled that cold smile and told her to be more careful around the equipment. Sarah wanted to report what was happening, but Morrison had made it clear that no one would believe her word against his. He had 15 years of service, commendations from multiple tours overseas, and the respect of everyone on base. She was just a tech specialist who had been there less than 6 months. Morrison reminded her of this fact regularly, often adding that military justice could be very harsh on soldiers who made false accusations against their superiors. The isolation was perhaps worse than the abuse itself. Sarah had always been shy, but now she became almost completely withdrawn. She stopped eating in the common areas, instead grabbing sandwiches and eating alone at her workstation. She avoided eye contact with other soldiers and spoke only when directly addressed. At night, she would lie awake in her small barracks room, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to escape a situation that seemed impossible. Morrison seemed to sense her growing desperation and used it to his advantage. He began assigning her to maintenance shifts in remote areas of the base, places where they were unlikely to be interrupted. During these assignments, his behavior became increasingly aggressive. He would corner her in equipment rooms, pressing his body against hers while pretending to examine her work. His hands would wander as he criticized her performance, and Sarah learned to simply endure it in silence, knowing that resistance only made things worse. The other soldiers on base saw Sarah as quiet and dedicated, but they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. Morrison was careful to maintain his professional demeanor in front of others, playing the role of a demanding but fair supervisor. He even praised Sarah's technical skills in front of the other sergeants, which made her situation feel even more surreal and hopeless. Sarah's family back home in Texas began to notice changes during their weekly phone calls. Her mother commented that she sounded tired and asked if she was eating enough. Her younger brother, who had always looked up to her decision to join the military, sensed something was wrong but couldn't put his finger on what it was. Sarah became expert at deflecting their concerns, insisting that everything was fine and that she was just adjusting to military life. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday evening in July. Morrison had assigned Sarah to update the communication systems in a building on the far edge of the base, a place that was rarely visited after hours. As she worked to replace outdated equipment, Morrison appeared in the doorway, locking it behind him. This time, his intentions were unmistakably clear, and Sarah realized that her months of silent endurance had only encouraged him to push further. What happened in that room would haunt Sarah for months afterward. Morrison's assault was brutal and methodical, punctuated by threats about what would happen if she ever spoke about it. He reminded her that she was nothing, that her word meant nothing, and that reporting the incident would only destroy her own career while leaving his untouched. When it was over, he straightened his uniform, told her to clean herself up, and left her alone in the dark room. Sarah sat on the cold floor for nearly an hour, her body shaking uncontrollably. She felt as though something fundamental inside her had broken, something that might never be repaired. The confident young woman who had enlisted to serve her country felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone hollow and afraid. She eventually forced herself to stand, to gather her tools, and to walk back to her barracks as if nothing had happened. That night, Sarah made a decision that would define the next phase of her ordeal. She would not report what Morrison had done. She convinced herself that survival meant silence, that speaking up would only make things worse. She had no way of knowing that her silence would become a prison of its own, or that her salvation would eventually come from the most unexpected source imaginable. The weeks following the assault blurred together in a haze of mechanical routine and desperate avoidance. Sarah threw herself into her technical work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, learning every system on the base with photographic precision. She arrived early and stayed late, not because Morrison demanded it, but because the alternative was having idle time to think about what had happened to her. Morrison seemed satisfied with her compliance and settled into a pattern of regular harassment that stopped just short of another full assault. He would find her during her shifts, making crude comments about that night in the equipment room, reminding her how easily he could make her life even more miserable if she stepped out of line. Sarah learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the particular way he cleared his throat before speaking to her. These small warnings became her early alert system, allowing her to brace herself for whatever humiliation was coming next. Her work performance, surprisingly, began to earn recognition from other departments. Sarah's desperate need to lose herself in technical problems led to innovative solutions for communication issues that had plagued the base for months. She redesigned several outdated systems and caught critical maintenance problems before they could cause major failures. Other technicians started seeking her advice, though Sarah rarely engaged in conversations that weren't strictly work-related. Lieutenant Colonel James Weber, the base communications director, noticed Sarah's exceptional work during a routine inspection. He was impressed by the organized efficiency of her workstation and the detailed maintenance logs she kept. Weber made a mental note to commend her dedication in Morrison's next performance review, having no idea that his praise would only make Sarah's situation more complicated. Morrison's reaction to the positive attention Sarah was receiving was predictably vindictive. He began sabotaging her work in subtle ways, loosening connections she had just tightened or reassigning her completed projects to other technicians who would receive credit for her efforts. When Sarah tried to point out these discrepancies, Morrison would gaslight her, suggesting that the stress of military life was affecting her memory and attention to detail. The psychological torture was in many ways worse than the physical abuse. Sarah began to doubt her own perceptions, wondering if she was losing her mind or if Morrison was truly as manipulative as she believed. She started keeping a secret journal hidden in her footlocker, documenting each incident with Morrison in careful detail. Writing became her only outlet for the rage and fear that she couldn't express anywhere else. During this period, Sarah's physical health began to deteriorate noticeably. She lost weight rapidly, her uniforms hanging loose on her shrinking frame. Dark circles formed under her eyes from months of restless sleep interrupted by nightmares. She developed a persistent cough that the base medical staff attributed to stress and prescribed rest that she couldn't take. Her hands, once steady enough to work with the most delicate electronic components, developed a slight tremor that she tried desperately to hide. The isolation became more profound as other soldiers began to notice her withdrawn behavior. Some attributed it to the pressures of military life, while others simply wrote her off as antisocial. Sarah's bunkmate, Private Jessica Chen, made several attempts to draw her into conversations or social activities, but Sarah's responses were so distant and uncomfortable that Jessica eventually stopped trying. This suited Sarah fine, as maintaining relationships felt impossible when she was carrying such a devastating secret. Morrison's abuse expanded beyond the sexual harassment to include systematic professional undermining. He began giving Sarah impossible tasks with unrealistic deadlines, then criticizing her publicly when she couldn't complete them perfectly. He would assign her to work details during meals, ensuring she missed the few social interactions that might have provided some relief from her isolation. He seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating her in front of other soldiers, knowing that her silence was guaranteed. The psychological pressure reached a breaking point one evening in September when Sarah found herself alone in the communications building with a loaded service weapon during a routine security check. For several long minutes, she stared at the weapon and seriously considered ending her suffering permanently. The thought terrified her so much that she immediately secured the weapon and spent the rest of her shift sitting on the floor, sobbing quietly into her hands. That night marked a subtle shift in Sarah's mindset. The brush with suicidal thoughts forced her to acknowledge that her current coping strategy was not sustainable. She began to consider, for the first time since the assault, that speaking up might be her only path to survival. The idea still terrified her, but the alternative was becoming increasingly unthinkable. Sarah started paying closer attention to the command structure on the base, trying to identify someone who might listen to her story without immediately dismissing it. She observed the interactions between different officers, looking for signs of integrity and fairness that might indicate a sympathetic ear. This careful observation would prove crucial in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, rumors began circulating about an upcoming visit from high-ranking military officials. The base was preparing for what seemed to be an important inspection or ceremony, though the details remained classified. Sarah noticed increased activity in the communications department as they prepared to ensure all systems would be functioning flawlessly during the visit. Morrison's behavior became even more erratic as the pressure of the upcoming inspection mounted. He seemed to be taking his stress out on Sarah more frequently, his abuse escalating in both frequency and severity. Sarah began to wonder if the impending visit might provide some kind of opportunity, though she couldn't yet imagine what form that opportunity might take. The announcement finally came during a Monday morning formation. General Patricia Hawthorne, a highly decorated Navy SEAL and current director of military personnel policy, would be visiting the base for 3 days to review operational readiness and personnel procedures. The announcement sent a ripple of nervous excitement through the ranks, as visits from officials of General Hawthorne's caliber were extremely rare. Sarah had heard of General Hawthorne before. The woman was legendary in military circles, one of the first female SEALs and a fierce advocate for military personnel rights. She had a reputation for being absolutely uncompromising when it came to military standards and equally uncompromising in her protection of soldiers under her command. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. General Patricia Hawthorne arrived at Camp Pendleton on a crisp October morning that seemed to energize the entire base with nervous anticipation. Sarah caught her first glimpse of the general during the welcoming ceremony, standing at attention with the rest of her unit as the convoy of black vehicles pulled up to the main administrative building. Even from a distance, General Hawthorne commanded attention with her straight-backed posture and the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her every movement. The general was smaller than Sarah had expected, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, but there was something about her presence that made her seem much larger. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the ribbons and decorations of someone who had spent decades earning respect through action rather than politics. When she spoke during the brief welcoming remarks, her voice carried clearly across the formation, strong and assured without being loud. Over the next 2 days, General Hawthorne conducted a thorough review of base operations that touched every department and every level of command. She had a reputation for speaking directly to enlisted personnel rather than relying solely on officers' reports, and she moved through the base with the easy familiarity of someone who had started her career in the ranks. Sarah heard from other soldiers that the general asked pointed questions and seemed to see through any attempts to gloss over problems or present overly optimistic assessments. Morrison was in a state of barely controlled panic throughout the inspection period. He had clearly heard the same stories about General Hawthorne's direct approach and was terrified that something might reflect poorly on his leadership. He became even more demanding than usual, barking orders at his subordinates and checking their work multiple times throughout the day. Sarah noticed that he was careful to maintain his professional facade whenever there was any chance the general might observe their interactions. On the second day of the inspection, General Hawthorne toured the communications facility. Sarah had spent hours ensuring that every piece of equipment was functioning perfectly, knowing that Morrison would hold her personally responsible for any problems. She kept her head down and focused on her work as the general's entourage moved through the building, hopping to remain invisible as she had learned to do so well. But General Hawthorne noticed details that others missed. She paused at Sarah's workstation, examining the meticulously organized tools and the detailed maintenance logs that Sarah kept. The general asked Lieutenant Colonel Weber several technical questions that he had to defer to Sarah for answers. Despite her nervousness, Sarah found herself explaining complex system modifications she had implemented, her knowledge and competence evident even through her obvious anxiety. General Hawthorne listened intently to Sarah's explanations, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated her own technical background. Sarah was struck by the general's genuine interest in the work and her willingness to acknowledge expertise regardless of rank. It was a stark contrast to Morrison's style of leadership, which relied on intimidation and put-downs rather than respect for competence. After the tour concluded, Sarah overheard Morrison speaking to some of the other sergeants about the inspection. He was clearly pleased with how it had gone, boasting about the efficiency of his department and taking credit for innovations that Sarah had developed. His casual appropriation of her work stung, but Sarah had long since become accustomed to this kind of theft. The third and final day of the inspection began with individual personnel interviews. General Hawthorne had requested private meetings with a selection of soldiers from different departments and ranks, apparently chosen at random. Sarah was not initially on the list, which came as both a relief and a disappointment. Part of her had begun to fantasize about having the opportunity to speak directly with someone of the general's stature and reputation. That afternoon, however, Sarah received an unexpected summons to report to the conference room where General Hawthorne was conducting her interviews. Apparently, Lieutenant Colonel Weber had recommended her as an example of exceptional technical competence, and the general wanted to discuss her innovations with the communication systems. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized she would be speaking one-on-one with the most senior officer she had ever encountered. Morrison intercepted Sarah on her way to the conference room, grabbing her arm hard enough to leave marks and pulling her into an empty storage closet. His face was flushed with anger and something that looked like fear. He told her in explicit terms what would happen to her if she said anything during her interview that reflected poorly on his leadership. He reminded her of their previous encounters and made it clear that her silence was not optional. The threats continued for several minutes, each one more graphic and terrifying than the last. Morrison seemed to be losing control, his usual calculated cruelty replaced by something more desperate and dangerous. Sarah realized that he was genuinely afraid of what she might say to General Hawthorne, and this fear was making him reckless in a way that could be very dangerous for her. When Morrison finally released her, Sarah had to spend several minutes in a bathroom stall trying to compose herself before reporting for her interview. Her hands were shaking badly, and she could still feel the bruises forming where Morrison had grabbed her arms. She practiced breathing exercises her mother had taught her as a child, trying to find some measure of calm before facing the general. The conference room was smaller than Sarah had expected, furnished with a simple table and chairs that made the setting feel more like a conversation than an interrogation. General Hawthorne was seated with her back to the window, and she gestured for Sarah to take the chair across from her. The general's manner was professional but warm, and she began by thanking Sarah for taking time from her duties to speak with her. For the first 20 minutes, they discussed Sarah's technical work in detail. The general asked thoughtful questions about the system modifications and seemed genuinely impressed by Sarah's innovative approaches to common problems. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as she talked about work, the familiar technical details providing a refuge from the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. But General Hawthorne was observant in ways that went far beyond technical competence. She noticed the tremor in Sarah's hands, the way Sarah flinched when she raised her voice slightly, and the careful way Sarah avoided making direct eye contact. Years of leadership experience had taught the general to recognize signs of distress that others might miss. As their conversation continued, General Hawthorne's questions became more personal. She asked about Sarah's adjustment to military life, her relationships with fellow soldiers, and her overall satisfaction with her assignment. The questions were gentle but persistent, and Sarah could feel the general's sharp intelligence probing for information that went beyond the surface-level responses. Sarah tried desperately to maintain the facade that everything was fine, but she was exhausted from months of pretending, and the recent encounter with Morrison had left her even more fragile than usual. When General Hawthorne asked directly if there was anything about her experience at the base that concerned her, Sarah felt something inside her beginning to crack. The moment stretched on in silence as Sarah struggled with the decision that could change everything. General Hawthorne waited patiently, her eyes kind but unwavering, as if she could see the internal battle that was raging behind Sarah's carefully maintained composure. The weight of months of abuse and silence hung in the air between them, waiting for Sarah to find the courage to finally speak her truth. The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Sarah stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, fighting an internal war between the desperate need to speak and the paralyzing fear that had kept her silent for so long. General Hawthorne waited with the patience of someone who understood that some truths needed time to surface. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sarah began to speak. The words came haltingly at first, fragments of experiences she had buried so deeply that bringing them to light felt like excavating pieces of her own soul. She told the general about Morrison's escalating harassment, about the isolation and fear that had consumed her life for months, about the assault that had shattered something fundamental inside her. As Sarah's story unfolded, General Hawthorne's expression remained carefully neutral, but her eyes grew harder with each detail. She occasionally asked gentle, clarifying questions, never pushing for more than Sarah was ready to give, but ensuring she understood the full scope of what had been happening. The general's professional composure never wavered, but Sarah could sense the controlled fury building beneath the surface. When Sarah reached the part of her story about Morrison's threats just before the interview, General Hawthorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She asked to see Sarah's arms, and when Sarah rolled up her sleeves to reveal the fresh bruises, the general's expression became absolutely glacial. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, and Sarah glimpsed the warrior who had earned respect in the most dangerous and demanding military units in the world. General Hawthorne asked Sarah if she was willing to make a formal statement about everything that had happened. The question sent a fresh wave of terror through Sarah's chest, but there was something about the general's unwavering presence that made the possibility seem less hopeless than it had before. For the first time in months, Sarah felt as though someone was truly listening to her, someone who had the power to actually do something about her situation. The formal interview process took several more hours, with General Hawthorne calling in a military lawyer and a specialized investigator to document Sarah's statement. The general insisted that Sarah be examined by the base medical officer to document her injuries and any other evidence of the abuse she had suffered. Throughout the entire process, General Hawthorne remained present, offering quiet support and ensuring that Sarah understood each step of the procedure. The most difficult part came when General Hawthorne explained that Morrison would need to be confronted with the allegations and given an opportunity to respond. Sarah's terror at this prospect was so visible that the general immediately assured her that Morrison would be confined and stripped of his authority over her pending a full investigation. There would be no opportunity for retaliation, and Sarah would be placed under the protection of officers who reported directly to the general. That evening, General Hawthorne personally oversaw Morrison's arrest. She had spent the afternoon reviewing his personnel file and conducting discreet inquiries that revealed a pattern of complaints about his behavior that had been systematically ignored or covered up by his superiors. The general's investigation also uncovered 2 other female soldiers who had experienced similar abuse, but had been too afraid to come forward with formal complaints. Morrison's reaction to his arrest was exactly what Sarah had expected. He vehemently denied all allegations and launched into a character assassination of Sarah, claiming she was unstable and vindictive. He pointed to his years of exemplary service and the respect he commanded from his peers as evidence that the charges were fabricated. His confidence suggested that he genuinely believed his position and reputation would protect him from consequences. General Hawthorne listened to Morrison's denials with the same professional composure she had shown during Sarah's interview, but those who knew her could see the controlled fury in her eyes. When Morrison finished his protests, the general informed him that he was being relieved of all duties pending a formal court-martial. His access to the base was revoked, and he would be held in military detention until trial. The news of Morrison's arrest spread through the base within hours, creating a mixture of shock and speculation among the soldiers who had known him. Some expressed disbelief that someone they had respected could be capable of such actions, while others quietly admitted they had sensed something unsettling about him, but had never been able to put their finger on what it was. Sarah found herself in a strange and uncomfortable position as word of the situation leaked out despite efforts to keep the details confidential. Some soldiers looked at her with sympathy and respect for her courage in coming forward, while others seemed to blame her for disrupting the unit and damaging Morrison's reputation. The mixed reactions reminded her why she had been so afraid to speak up in the first place. General Hawthorne made it a point to check on Sarah regularly during the investigation period. She arranged for Sarah to receive counseling from specialists who understood military sexual trauma and ensured that she was temporarily reassigned to duties that would minimize stress while she recovered from her ordeal. The general's personal attention sent a clear message to everyone on the base about how seriously she took the situation. During one of their conversations, General Hawthorne revealed that she had suspected something was wrong from the moment she met Sarah during the communications tour. Years of leadership had taught her to recognize the signs of a soldier in distress, and Sarah's combination of exceptional technical competence and obvious emotional trauma had raised immediate red flags. The general had specifically requested the individual interview as an opportunity to investigate her suspicions. The revelation that her suffering had been visible to someone with the experience to recognize it was both comforting and embarrassing to Sarah. She had worked so hard to hide what was happening to her, but General Hawthorne's trained eye had seen through her facade almost immediately. It made her wonder how many other people might have noticed signs, but chosen not to act on them. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Morrison's abuse of Sarah was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior that had been enabled by a toxic culture of silence and intimidation. General Hawthorne expanded her inquiry to examine the command structure that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked, determining that several officers would face disciplinary action for their failure to protect the soldiers under their command. The court-martial proceedings were scheduled to begin within 6 weeks, and Sarah would be required to testify as the primary witness. The prospect terrified her, but General Hawthorne assured her that she would have full support throughout the process. The general had personally selected the prosecution team and would remain on the base until Morrison was brought to justice. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Sarah began to feel something that resembled hope. The nightmare that had consumed her life for months was finally coming to an end, and she had found an unexpected ally in one of the most powerful and respected officers in the military. General Hawthorne had not only believed her story, but had taken immediate and decisive action to ensure justice would be served. The path ahead would still be difficult, with the trial and the long process of healing from trauma that had changed her fundamentally. But Sarah no longer felt alone in facing these challenges. She had found her voice again, and more importantly, she had found someone willing to listen and act on what she heard. The court-martial of Sergeant Derek Morrison began on a cold November morning that marked exactly 1 year since Sarah had first arrived at Camp Pendleton. The military courtroom was austere and formal, filled with officers whose stern expressions reflected the gravity of the charges being heard. Sarah sat in the witness section, her dress uniform pressed and perfect, General Hawthorne beside her offering silent support. Morrison had retained a skilled military defense attorney who immediately attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by highlighting her emotional state and suggesting that her accusations were the result of mental instability brought on by the pressures of military life. The defense painted Morrison as a dedicated career soldier who had been falsely accused by a troubled subordinate seeking attention and revenge for legitimate disciplinary actions. But the prosecution team that General Hawthorne had assembled was thorough and relentless. They had spent weeks building a case that went far beyond Sarah's testimony, uncovering financial records, communication logs, and witness statements that painted a picture of Morrison's predatory behavior spanning several years and multiple assignments. The evidence was damning and impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. Sarah's testimony took the better part of 2 days. She spoke clearly and steadily about her experiences, her voice growing stronger as she recounted the months of abuse that had nearly destroyed her. The defense attorney's attempts to rattle her with aggressive questioning only served to highlight her credibility and the obvious trauma she had endured. Several members of the jury were visibly affected by her composed but heartbreaking account. The turning point in the trial came when 2 other female soldiers took the stand to testify about their own experiences with Morrison. Their stories were remarkably similar to Sarah's, following the same pattern of escalating harassment and abuse that Morrison had clearly perfected over years of preying on subordinates. The defense's claims of false accusations became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of such consistent testimony. General Hawthorne herself testified about the investigation she had conducted and the systematic failures of leadership that had allowed Morrison's behavior to continue unchecked. Her testimony was devastating not only to Morrison, but to several officers who had ignored warning signs and failed in their duty to protect the soldiers under their command. The general's reputation and credibility made her testimony particularly damaging to the defense. The medical evidence presented during the trial was clinical but powerful. The base medical officer testified about Sarah's physical and psychological condition when she was first examined, describing injuries and trauma responses that were entirely consistent with her allegations. The defense's attempts to suggest alternative explanations for her condition were unconvincing and appeared desperate to the jury. Morrison himself chose to testify in his own defense, a decision that proved to be a critical mistake. Under cross-examination, he became defensive and aggressive, displaying the same intimidating behavior that had characterized his abuse of Sarah and the other victims. His testimony revealed an arrogance and sense of entitlement that made his guilt seem obvious to everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution's closing arguments systematically dismantled every aspect of Morrison's defense, presenting a timeline of abuse that was supported by overwhelming evidence and multiple credible witnesses. They emphasized that this was not simply a case of personal misconduct, but a betrayal of the military's core values and a violation of the trust that soldiers must have in their leaders. When the verdict was read 3 days later, Morrison was found guilty on all charges including sexual assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The sentence included 25 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all military benefits. The severity of the sentence sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated in the modern military. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched Morrison being led away in shackles. There was relief that justice had been served and that he would never be able to harm another soldier the way he had harmed her. But there was also a profound sadness for the person she had been before the abuse began, someone who felt lost forever despite the legal victory. In the weeks following the trial, General Hawthorne worked to implement systematic changes designed to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. She established new reporting procedures that provided multiple channels for soldiers to report abuse without fear of retaliation. She also mandated training programs for all officers on recognizing and responding to signs of sexual harassment and assault. The general's reforms extended beyond Camp Pendleton to influence military policy at the highest levels. Her report on the Morrison case and the institutional failures that enabled his crimes became required reading at military leadership schools. The changes she advocated for were gradually implemented across all branches of the military, creating lasting improvements in how such cases were handled. For Sarah, the path to healing was longer and more difficult than the legal proceedings. She continued working in communications while attending regular counseling sessions to address the trauma she had experienced. The nightmares gradually became less frequent, and she slowly began to rebuild relationships with fellow soldiers who had supported her throughout the ordeal. General Hawthorne maintained contact with Sarah long after the trial concluded, checking on her progress and offering guidance as she worked to reconstruct her life and career. The general became something of a mentor, helping Sarah see that her experience, while devastating, had also revealed a strength and resilience that could serve her well in whatever path she chose to follow. 6 months after Morrison's conviction, Sarah received an unexpected opportunity. General Hawthorne recommended her for a prestigious assignment working with military communication systems at the Pentagon, a position that would advance her career significantly while removing her from the environment where she had suffered so much trauma. Sarah accepted the assignment, seeing it as a chance to start fresh while using her technical skills to serve her country at the highest level. As Sarah prepared to leave Camp Pendleton, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that terrifying day when she had finally found the courage to speak her truth to General Hawthorne. She had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, and learned that sometimes justice was possible even when it seemed hopeless. The quiet young woman who had endured abuse in silence had found her voice and used it to create change that would protect countless other soldiers from experiencing what she had suffered. Her courage in speaking up had not only saved herself, but had helped create a safer environment for all military personnel. On her last day at the base, General Hawthorne personally saw Sarah off as she departed for her new assignment. The general addressed her not as a victim who had been rescued, but as a soldier who had demonstrated exceptional courage under the most difficult circumstances. For Sarah, being recognized for her strength rather than pitied for her suffering marked the true beginning of her recovery and her future as a leader in her own right.